The gunshot that killed Hannah's husband hadn't been meant for him, but that detail mattered little to the marshal who wanted her hanged for murder. She stood at the edge of Douglas, Arizona in the spring of 1878, watching the dust settle on the main street as another stagecoach rolled through, carrying passengers who had no idea that the woman in the faded calico dress was supposedly the most dangerous criminal in Cochise County. Her hands trembled as she gripped the small carpet bag containing everything she owned in this world, which wasn't much considering she had fled her home 3 days ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and the truth burning in her chest like a brand. The truth that nobody wanted to hear, the truth that had made her a fugitive, the truth that Marshal Garrett had decided was nothing more than the desperate lies of a guilty woman. Hannah Lawson had been 22 years old when she married Thomas Brennan, a cattle broker with smooth words and rougher hands than she had realized during their brief courtship. By 24, she had learned that her husband's business dealings involved far more than honest livestock trading, and by the time she turned 25 last winter, she had discovered he was part of a rustling operation that stretched from southern Arizona all the way into New Mexico territory. She had kept silent because speaking up meant putting herself in danger, but 3 days ago, everything had shattered like glass under a hammer. The memory played in her mind as she stood there in the lengthening shadows of Douglas. Thomas had been in their small ranch house outside of Tombstone, counting money from the latest stolen herd when someone had kicked in the door. Hannah had been in the kitchen, flour dusting her hands from making biscuits when she heard the angry voices. She had rushed to the doorway just in time to see Frank Morrison, one of Thomas's partners, raise his pistol and fire. The bullet had caught Thomas in the chest, and he had fallen backward, blood spreading across his shirt like spilled wine. Frank had turned to her then, his eyes wild with panic and rage. He was going to turn us all in, said he made a deal with the marshal. Hannah had backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I won't say anything, I swear it." But Frank had laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You think I'm fool enough to believe that? No, this is going to look different. This is going to be your fault, Hannah Brennan." He had fired twice more into Thomas's already still body, then pressed the gun into Hannah's hand before she could pull away. The hot metal had burned her palm, and she had dropped it immediately, but Frank was already shouting for help, already spinning his story. By the time their nearest neighbor arrived, Frank had painted a picture of a wife who had discovered her husband's infidelity and taken revenge in a moment of passion. Never mind that there had been no other woman. Never mind that Hannah had powder burns on only one hand, not both. Never mind that the angle of the shots made no sense if she had been the shooter. Marshal Garrett had arrived within hours, and Hannah had seen immediately that he wasn't interested in the truth. Garrett and Frank were old friends, had served together in the war, and whatever story Frank told was gospel as far as the marshal was concerned. Hannah had been arrested on the spot, dragged to the Tombstone jail in shackles while Frank watched with cold satisfaction in his eyes. She had spent 2 days in that cell before a sympathetic deputy named Charlie Worth had unlocked her door in the middle of the night. "I don't believe Frank's story," he had whispered, "and I heard him and the marshal talking. They're planning to make sure you hang, regardless of what any trial might say. You need to run, Mrs. Brennan. Run and don't look back." So she had run. She had taken the horse Charlie provided and ridden through the darkness until her legs ached and her throat was raw with dust. She had sold the horse in Bisbee for far less than it was worth, bought passage on a freight wagon to Douglas, and now stood here wondering what came next. Behind her was a murder charge and a marshal determined to see her pay for a crime she hadn't committed. Ahead was nothing but uncertainty, and the fading hope that somewhere in this vast territory she might find safety. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Hannah knew she needed to find shelter before full dark, but she had exactly $3.20 to her name, which wasn't enough for more than a night or two at even the cheapest boarding house. She started walking down the dusty main street, past the saloon where raucous laughter spilled through the doors, past the general store closing up for the evening, past the livery stable where horses nickered softly in their stalls. She was so focused on finding somewhere to spend the night that she didn't notice the group of men until she was almost upon them. They stood in a loose circle outside the telegraph office, and as Hannah drew near, one of them stepped into her path. He was tall and broad, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no kindness. "Well now," he said, and his voice carried the slow drawl of Texas. "Don't believe I've seen you around Douglas before." Hannah tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again. "I'm just passing through," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear climbing her spine. "Passing through," another man repeated and laughed. "Hear that, boys? Ladies just passing through." "Might be you're passing through for a reason," the first man said. He leaned closer, and Hannah could smell whiskey on his breath. "Might be you're running from something, or someone." Her blood turned cold. Had word already spread from Tombstone? Had Marshal Garrett sent telegrams to neighboring towns, painting her as a dangerous fugitive? She clutched her carpetbag tighter and tried once more to move past, but the man grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh through the thin fabric of her dress. "Now don't be unfriendly," he said. "We're just being neighborly." "Let me go," Hannah said, and she heard the tremor in her own voice that she had been trying to suppress. "I don't think so. Think maybe you and I should have a little talk about what brings a lady like you to our town." Hannah was pulling against his grip, her heart racing when a new voice cut through the evening air like a blade. "The lady asked you to let her go." Everyone turned. A man stood about 10 feet away, and Hannah's first impression was of stillness, the kind of absolute calm that came before a storm. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore dusty range clothes and a gun belt that sat low on his hips, and everything about his posture suggested he knew exactly how to use the weapon he carried. The man holding Hannah's arm didn't release her, but his grip loosened slightly. "This ain't your business, stranger." "I'm making it my business," the newcomer said quietly. His gaze flicked to Hannah, then back to the men. "Let her go. Now." There was a long moment when Hannah wasn't sure what would happen. The tension stretched tight as a wire, and she could feel the man's fingers still pressing into her arm. Then, slowly, he released her and stepped back. "Just being friendly," he muttered. "Find someone else to be friendly with," the stranger said. He didn't move, didn't touch his gun, but something in his voice made it clear that the conversation was over. The group of men exchanged glances, then drifted away, muttering among themselves. Hannah stood frozen, her arm aching where she had been grabbed, her breath coming in short gasps. The stranger waited until the men were out of earshot before he approached her. "You all right, madam?" he asked, and his voice was gentler now, though it still carried an edge of concern. Hannah nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just gray, they held flecks of blue like chips of sky in a storm cloud. There was a scar along his jawline, faint but visible, and calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work and long days in the saddle. "Name's Lucas Owens," he said. "And you look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to spend the night." She wanted to refuse. Taking help from a stranger seemed dangerous, especially given her circumstances. but she was exhausted and frightened and running out of options. "Hannah Lawson," she said, using her maiden name without thinking. Then she winced, realizing she had just given him her real name when she should have made something up. If Lucas noticed her reaction, he didn't comment on it. "There's a boarding house run by Mrs. Chen about 3 blocks from here. Clean rooms, decent food, and she doesn't ask too many questions. Come on, I'll walk you there." Hannah hesitated, then fell into step beside him. She kept glancing at him from the corner of her eye, trying to figure out what kind of man would step in to help a complete stranger. In her experience, men generally wanted something in return for their kindness, and she wasn't sure what price Lucas Owens might expect. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps raising small clouds of dust from the unpaved street. Finally, Hannah gathered her courage and asked, "Why did you help me?" Lucas was quiet for a moment. "My mother was in a situation like that once when I was a boy. Man wouldn't leave her alone outside a mercantile in Abilene. A stranger stepped in then, sent the man on his way. I never forgot it." He glanced at her. "Besides, those particular fellows have a reputation for causing trouble. Figured you didn't need that kind of attention." "Thank you," Hannah said softly. "I don't have much money, but I can pay you back somehow." "Don't want payment," Lucas said. "Just doing what's right." They arrived at a modest 2-story building with a painted sign that read "Chen's Boarding House" in neat letters. Lucas held the door open for Hannah, and they stepped into a small but spotlessly clean entryway. A Chinese woman in her 50s appeared from a back room, her face lighting up when she saw Lucas. "Mr. Owens," she said warmly. "Good to see you. And who is this?" "This is Miss Hannah Lawson," Lucas said. "She needs a room for the night, maybe longer, Mrs." Chen studied Hannah with keen eyes, taking in the dusty dress, the tired face, the carpetbag clutched in white-knuckled hands. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her because she nodded. "Room number 5 is available. $2 a week, meals included. You look hungry. I have stew on the stove." $2 a week. Hannah did the mental arithmetic. She could afford 1 week, maybe 2 if she was very careful with the remaining money. After that, she would need to find work. But work meant staying in one place, and staying in one place meant risking Marshall Garrett catching up to her. Lucas must have seen the worry on her face because he spoke up. "Mrs. Chen, would you happen to know anyone in town looking to hire help? Miss Lawson is going to need employment." Mrs. Chen tapped one finger against her chin. "The schoolteacher, Miss Foster, has been looking for an assistant. And the general store could use someone. I will ask around." "That would be very kind," Hannah said. She reached into her small purse and counted out $2, leaving her with $1.20. Mrs. Chen took the money and handed her a key. "Room 5, up the stairs and to the left. Supper will be ready in 20 minutes. You have time to wash up." Hannah climbed the narrow stairs, her legs heavy with exhaustion. Room 5 was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window that looked out over the darkening street. She set her carpetbag on the bed and sank down beside it, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the past 3 days. She had killed no one. She had done nothing wrong. But she was a fugitive anyway, running from a law that cared more about convenience than truth. And now she was in Douglas, Arizona, with almost no money, no prospects, and no idea how long she could stay ahead of Marshall Garrett. A soft knock on the door made her jump. "Yes, it's Mrs. Chen. I brought up some warm water for washing." Hannah opened the door to find the older woman holding a steaming pitcher. "Thank you," she said, taking it carefully. Mrs. Chen didn't leave immediately. Instead, she studied Hannah with those keen eyes again. "You are running from something," she said, and it wasn't a question. Hannah's throat closed up. She couldn't speak, couldn't deny it. I came to this country running from something too, Mrs. Chen continued quietly. Many years ago. I understand what it is to be afraid to look over your shoulder. You are safe here in my house. I do not share my guest's business with anyone. Tears pricked Hannah's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Chen patted her shoulder gently. Wash your face, eat some food. Tomorrow will be easier than today. After the older woman left, Hannah poured the warm water into the basin and scrubbed the dust from her face and hands. She unpinned her dark hair, shook it out and braided it again, securing it with the few pins she had left. When she looked in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner than it had been a month ago, and there were shadows under her green eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had lost everything and was trying desperately to survive. When she went downstairs for supper, she found Lucas Owens sitting at the long table in Mrs. Chen's dining room. He stood when she entered, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that surprised her. 3 other boarders were already eating, an elderly prospector with whiskers down to his chest, a young man who looked like a store clerk, and a woman in her 30s wearing a traveling dress. Hannah took a seat across from Lucas, and Mrs. Chen brought out bowls of rich beef stew with chunks of potato and carrot, along with thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. Hannah hadn't realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite. She had to force herself to eat slowly, to not wolf down the food like a starving animal. "So what brings you to Douglas, Miss Lawson?" the elderly prospector asked between mouthfuls of stew. Hannah froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. She hadn't prepared a story, hadn't thought about what she would say when people inevitably asked questions. "She's looking for a fresh start," Lucas said smoothly before Hannah could fumble for an answer. "Plenty of folks come to Arizona territory for that reason." The prospector nodded sagely. "Ain't that the truth? I came out here in '63, been wandering these hills ever since. Territory's good for fresh starts." The conversation moved on to other topics. The price of silver, the weather, the new restaurant opening next month. Hannah ate her stew and listened, grateful for Lucas's intervention. When the meal ended and the other boarders drifted away to their rooms or to evening activities in town, Hannah found herself alone with Lucas at the table. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Make excuses for me." Lucas leaned back in his chair. "Wasn't making excuses. Figured you'd tell your story when and if you wanted to." He paused. "But I should mention something. There was a marshal through here yesterday asking questions about a woman matching your description. Name of Garrett." Hannah's blood turned to ice. "He was here, in Douglas, passed through on his way to Bisbee, or so I heard. He's looking for a Hannah Brennan wanted for murder in Tombstone." Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together in her lap, trying to still them. "I didn't kill anyone," she said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I swear it. My husband was murdered by his partner and they blamed me for it." Lucas watched her steadily. "I believe you." Those 3 words hit Hannah like a physical force. "You do." "I've been around liars my whole life. You're not one." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "But believing you and keeping you safe are 2 different things. Garrett's got a reputation as a determined man. If he thinks you're in this area, he'll keep looking." "I know," Hannah said miserably. "I know I can't stay anywhere for long. I just needed somewhere to rest, to figure out what to do next." "What you do next is get some sleep," Lucas said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll figure out a plan. I know people in this territory, people who might be able to help. But tonight, you need to rest." Hannah wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she couldn't drag anyone else into her problems, but she was so tired, and the idea of having even one night of relative safety was too tempting to refuse. "All right," she agreed. Thank you, Mr. Owens. Lucas, he corrected. We're past formalities now, I think. She managed a small smile. Lucas, then, and I'm Hannah. She went upstairs to her small room and lay down on the narrow bed without even removing her dress. Through the thin walls, she could hear the muted sounds of the boarding house settling for the night. Footsteps in the hallway, a door closing, someone coughing. Outside, the sounds of Douglas after dark drifted through the window. Piano music from the saloon, voices raised in laughter or argument, a dog barking in the distance. Hannah closed her eyes and tried not to think about Marshall Garrett, tried not to imagine him arriving in Douglas with a warrant and a rope. Instead, she found herself thinking about Lucas Owens, about the calm way he had faced down those men, about the steadiness in his storm-gray eyes. She didn't understand why he was helping her, what he could possibly gain from involving himself in the problems of a fugitive woman. But she was grateful for it, grateful beyond words. She fell asleep eventually, and dreamed of riding through darkness on a horse with no name, chasing a horizon that never got any closer. When Hannah woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and the smell of coffee drifted up from downstairs. She sat up slowly, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was. Douglas, Mrs. Chen's boarding house. Safety, at least for now. She washed her face with the water left in the basin and did her best to make herself presentable. Her dress was wrinkled from sleeping in it, and she made a mental note to wash her spare dress as soon as possible. She couldn't afford to look like a vagrant if she hoped to find work. Downstairs, Mrs. Chen was serving breakfast. Eggs scrambled with bits of ham, more of that wonderful bread and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Lucas was already at the table and he nodded to Hannah as she took a seat. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Hannah admitted, which was true. She had thought nightmares would plague her, but instead she had slept heavily, dreamlessly for the first time in days. "Good," Lucas said, "because I've been thinking about your situation and I have an idea." Hannah spread butter on a slice of bread, trying to ignore the way her stomach clenched with anxiety. "What kind of idea?" "My ranch is about 15 miles northeast of here, up in the foothills. It's not much, just a small spread with cattle and horses, but it's isolated. If you needed somewhere to stay for a while, somewhere Garrett wouldn't think to look, you'd be welcome." Hannah stared at him. "You're inviting me to your ranch, but you barely know me." "I know enough," Lucas said. "I know you're in trouble through no fault of your own. I know you need help. And I've got a big, empty ranch house with plenty of space." He paused. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. You'd have your own room, your privacy, but it would give you time to figure out your next move without constantly looking over your shoulder." It was a generous offer, too generous. Hannah's instincts, honed by years of a difficult marriage, told her to be wary. "Why would you do this for me?" Lucas was quiet for a moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. "About 3 years ago I had a sister, Eleanor. She was 18, full of life and dreams. She fell in love with a man we all thought was decent, married him against our father's wishes. Turned out he wasn't decent at all. He drank, and when he drank, he got mean." His voice was flat, controlled, but Hannah could hear the pain underneath. "One night it went too far. He killed her. Beat her to death in a drunken rage." Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh God, Lucas, I'm so sorry." "The law said it was manslaughter, not murder. Said he didn't mean to do it, was too drunk to know what he was doing. He served 2 years in prison and walked away a free man." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Meanwhile, Eleanor was dead at 18 and our family was destroyed. My mother never recovered. She died a year later from a broken heart, or so the doctors said. My father sold the family ranch in Texas and drank himself into an early grave. And you, Hannah asked softly. I took what little inheritance there was and came to Arizona territory, started over, built something new. He met her eyes. I couldn't save Alina, couldn't make the law see that what happened to her was murder, pure and simple, but maybe I can help you. Maybe I can keep you from ending up like her, a victim of a justice system that doesn't care about the truth. Hannah felt tears sting her eyes. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come to the ranch, Lucas said. At least for a while, give yourself a chance. She thought about the alternative. Staying in Douglas where Marshall Garrett might show up at any moment, or moving on to another town with no money and no prospects. Neither option offered much hope. And despite her wariness, despite everything her experience had taught her about trusting men, she found herself wanting to believe in the sincerity she saw in Lucas's face. All right, she said finally. I'll come to your ranch, but I won't be a burden. I can cook, clean, help with whatever needs doing. I won't just take charity. A smile touched Lucas's lips, the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. I won't turn down help. Ranch work is never finished. We'll leave this afternoon if that suits you. Hannah nodded, her heart beating fast with a mixture of fear and something else, something that might have been hope. They left Douglas in the early afternoon, with Hannah riding beside Lucas on a gentle mare he had borrowed from the livery. Hannah hadn't ridden much since leaving Tombstone, and her muscles protested at first, but she gritted her teeth and endured. The landscape opened up around them, vast and beautiful and harsh. Rolling hills covered in scrub brush, distant mountains purple against the sky, the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking a creek or spring. Lucas rode easy in the saddle, clearly a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, a distinctive rock formation, a water hole used by cattle, the ruins of an old adobe building. He talked about his ranch, how he had bought the land 4 years ago and built it up from nothing. It's not fancy, he warned. The house is small, just 4 rooms, but it's solid and the roof doesn't leak. It sounds perfect, Hannah said, and meant it. They arrived at the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The house sat in a shallow valley with good grass and a creek running through it. Lucas had been modest in his description. The house was indeed small, built of adobe and wood with a covered porch, but it was well maintained and sturdy looking. Nearby stood a barn and several corrals, and Hannah could see cattle grazing in the distance. Lucas helped her down from the horse and led both animals to the barn. I'll get the horses settled, then show you the house, he said. Hannah waited on the porch, taking in her surroundings. The air was clean and clear, scented with sage and grass. Birds called from the cottonwoods along the creek. It was peaceful in a way she hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. Her life with Thomas had been full of tension and danger, even before his death. Before that, growing up in St. Louis, she had lived in a crowded city where peace was a rare commodity. But here, in this isolated valley, there was a quietness that seemed to seep into her bones. Lucas returned and unlocked the front door. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, a rocking chair by the hearth. Off the main room were 3 doors. Kitchen through there, Lucas said, pointing. My room on the left. The room on the right is yours. Hannah's room was small but had everything she needed. A bed with a real mattress, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It's wonderful, she said sincerely. Glad you think so, Lucas said. Make yourself comfortable. I need to check on the cattle before dark, but I'll be back in time to fix supper. I can make supper, Hannah offered quickly. I told you I wouldn't be a burden. Lucas studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. There's bacon and beans in the kitchen, some canned tomatoes, flour for biscuits. Whatever you can make from that would be appreciated. After he left, Hannah explored the kitchen. It was better stocked than she had expected, with a good stove and plenty of basics. She found a side of bacon hanging in the small larder, along with potatoes and onions. She set to work with a will, grateful to have something useful to do. By the time Lucas returned, dusty and tired, Hannah had bacon frying, potatoes roasting, and biscuits in the oven. He washed up at the pump outside, then came in sniffing the air appreciatively. "Smells good," he said. "Tastes good too, I hope," Hannah said, plating the food. They sat at the table, and for a while there was only the sound of eating. Hannah hadn't realized how good it felt to cook for someone, to sit at a table and share a meal. With Thomas, meals had always been tense affairs, full of silent anger or bitter words. This was different. This was companionable. "So tell me about yourself," Lucas said eventually. "If you're comfortable with it." Hannah set down her fork. "What do you want to know? Where you're from? How you ended up married to a cattle rustler? Whatever you want to tell me." She took a breath. "I grew up in St. Louis. My father was a clerk, my mother took in sewing. We weren't rich, but we got by. I was teaching at a small school for girls when I met Thomas. He was charming, attentive, everything a girl thinks she wants." She smiled bitterly. "I was 22 and foolish. I thought love was enough. We married quickly, and he brought me out to Arizona Territory. That's when I started learning who he really was." "Did he hurt you?" Lucas asked quietly. Hannah considered the question. "Not physically. He wasn't like Alina's husband, but he was cruel in other ways. He controlled everything, the money, where I could go, who I could talk to. And when I found out about the rustling, about the stealing, I wanted to leave. But I had no money of my own, nowhere to go, so I stayed." She met Lucas's eyes. "Until Frank Morrison killed him and decided I was a convenient scapegoat." "This Frank Morrison," Lucas said. "What can you tell me about him?" Hannah frowned. "Why?" "Because if we can prove he's the real killer, prove your innocence, then you wouldn't have to keep running." Hope flared in Hannah's chest, followed quickly by doubt. "How would we prove anything?" "It's my word against his, and he's got Marshall Garrett on his side." "Maybe," Lucas said, "but there's usually more evidence than people realize. You said the angle of the shots didn't make sense if you'd fired them. That's something. And if Morrison was Thomas's partner in rustling, there will be records, witnesses, something that ties them together. We just need to find it." "That's a lot of ifs," Hannah said. "It is," Lucas agreed. "But the alternative is spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, never settling anywhere, always afraid. Is that how you want to live?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood and began clearing the dishes. Lucas rose to help her, and they worked in silence, washing and drying the plates and utensils. Finally, as she was hanging up the dish towel, Hannah said, "I want to clear my name. I want people to know I didn't kill anyone, but I'm afraid. Garrett wants me hanged. Frank wants me dead. Fighting them seems impossible." Lucas dried his hands on his own towel. "Nothing's impossible, just hard, and you won't be fighting alone." That night, Hannah lay in her new bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, coyotes calling from the hills, the creak of the house settling. In the room across the hall, she could hear Lucas moving around, then the squeak of bed springs as he lay down. She was alone in a house with a man she barely knew, but strangely, she didn't feel afraid. There was something about Lucas that inspired trust, a fundamental decency that she sensed bone deep. She thought about what he had said, about proving her innocence, and for the first time since Frank had pressed that gun into her hand, she allowed herself to believe it might be possible. The next few days fell into a pattern. Hannah woke early and made breakfast while Lucas tended the animals. After eating, he would ride out to check on the cattle or mend fences or do any of the 100 tasks that kept a ranch running. Hannah stayed close to the house, cooking and cleaning, washing clothes in the creek, tending the small vegetable garden Lucas had planted. It was hard work, but honest work, and she found a satisfaction in it that she had never felt before. In the evenings, they would eat supper together and talk. Lucas told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about his dreams of building his ranch into something substantial. Hannah talked about her childhood in St. Louis, about her love of teaching, about the books she had read and the places she hoped to see someday. It was on the fourth evening that Lucas brought up the subject of her case again. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with orange and red. "I've been thinking about your husband's death," he said without preamble. "You said Frank claimed Thomas was going to turn them all in to the marshal. Is that something Thomas would have done?" Hannah considered. "I don't know. Thomas was many things, but he wasn't brave. Turning in his partners would have put him at risk. I can't see him doing it unless he had something to gain." "Like immunity from prosecution," Lucas suggested. "Maybe Thomas made a deal, give up his partners in exchange for walking free." "That would make sense," Hannah said slowly. "It would explain why Frank was so angry, why he said Thomas was going to turn them all in. So we need to find out if Thomas was in contact with the authorities. If he was, there would be records, letters, something." Lucas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Problem is, Marshal Garrett isn't going to share that information willingly." "No," Hannah agreed. "He won't. But there might be other lawmen involved. A case that big, involving rustling across territorial lines, would likely involve federal marshals too." Lucas glanced at her. "I know a federal marshal named James Cooper. Good man, honest. If anyone would be willing to look into this objectively, it's him." "Where is this Marshal Cooper?" "He works out of Tucson, mostly. That's about a 2-day ride from here." Hannah's stomach clenched. "You're thinking of going to Tucson? Of contacting him?" "I'm thinking of writing him a letter first, laying out the facts as you've told them to me, see if he's willing to investigate." It was a risk. Any contact with law enforcement was a risk. But Lucas was right. Living as a fugitive forever wasn't sustainable. At some point she would be caught, or she would have to disappear so completely that she might as well be dead. Neither option was acceptable. "All right," she said. "Write the letter." Lucas spent the evening drafting the letter while Hannah cleaned up after supper. He wrote slowly, carefully, choosing each word with precision. When he was finished, he read it aloud to her. It was a straightforward recounting of the facts. Hannah's marriage to Thomas Brennan, her discovery of his rustling activities, the night of his murder, Frank Morrison's accusation, Marshal Garrett's apparent bias. Lucas laid it all out clearly and asked Marshal Cooper to investigate the circumstances surrounding Thomas's death and the charges against Hannah. "You make it sound very logical," Hannah said when he finished reading. "Like the truth is obvious." "That's because it is obvious," Lucas said. "To anyone looking with open eyes." He rode into Douglas the next morning to post the letter, leaving Hannah alone at the ranch. She spent the day in a state of nervous energy, cleaning things that were already clean, baking bread they didn't need. When Lucas returned in the late afternoon, he found her sitting on the porch steps, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Letter's on its way to Tucson," he reported, dismounting. "Should arrive in a few days. Then it's just a matter of waiting for a response." "And what if Marshal Cooper doesn't believe me?" Hannah asked. "What if he sides with Garrett?" Lucas sat down beside her on the steps. "Then we try something else. But I don't think he will. Cooper's reputation is solid. He's known for following the evidence, not taking shortcuts. Hannah wanted to believe him. She wanted to have faith that the truth would prevail, but she had seen too much of how the world worked to be entirely confident. "And in the meantime, what do I do? Just wait. You live," Lucas said simply. "You work, you eat, you sleep. You remember that you're a person, not just a fugitive." It was good advice, but hard to follow. Every time Hannah heard hoofbeats approaching the ranch, her heart would leap into her throat. Every time Lucas rode into town for supplies, she worried he would be questioned, that someone would connect him to the woman Marshall Garrett was hunting. But days passed, then a week, and nothing happened. The routine of ranch life continued. Hannah found herself settling into it, finding rhythms and patterns that were comforting in their predictability. She learned which chickens were the best layers, which cattle tended to wander, how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the wind shifted. Lucas was a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to explain, and slowly, carefully, something was growing between them. Hannah felt it in the way Lucas smiled when he came in from a long day and smelled supper cooking. In the way he always asked her opinion about ranch decisions, treating her like a partner rather than a burden. In the way he would sometimes look at her across the dinner table with an expression she couldn't quite read, something soft and wondering. She felt it in herself, too, in the way her heart lifted when she heard his horse returning, in the attention she paid to her appearance each morning, in the dreams she had started having where his face featured prominently. It terrified her. She had been married before, had thought she knew what love was, and look how that had turned out. Thomas had seemed charming too at first. How could she trust her own judgment after being so wrong once? But Lucas wasn't Thomas. That much was becoming increasingly clear. Lucas listened when she talked. He respected her opinions. He never tried to control her or dictate her actions. When she said she wanted to help mend a fence line, he showed her how rather than telling her it was man's work. When she woke in the night from nightmares about Frank or Marshall Garrett, she would sometimes hear Lucas moving around in his room, as if he was keeping watch even in the dark hours. 2 weeks after Lucas had sent the letter, a rider appeared on the horizon. Hannah was hanging laundry when she spotted him, and her blood turned cold. Lucas was out checking the herd. She was alone. She stood frozen, a wet sheet in her hands as the rider drew closer. It was a man on a bay horse, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. When he was close enough, Hannah could see the badge pinned to his chest. A marshal. Her first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The ranch house offered no real hiding place, and she couldn't outrun a horse on foot. The marshal reined in near the house and dismounted. He was tall and lean, with gray streaking his dark hair and eyes that held both intelligence and kindness. "Afternoon, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm looking for Lucas Owens." Hannah's throat was too tight to speak for a moment. Then she managed, "He's out with the herd. Should be back soon." The marshal nodded. "Mind if I wait?" "Of course not," Hannah said, though her mind was screaming that she should mind very much. "Would you like some water? Coffee?" "Coffee would be welcome, thank you." Hannah led him to the porch, indicated a chair, then went inside on shaking legs. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee from the pot that was always warming on the stove. This was it. Somehow, someway, they had found her. She was going to be arrested, dragged back to Tombstone, hanged for a crime she didn't commit. She brought the coffee out to the porch, and the marshal accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Beautiful place," he commented, looking out over the valley. "Owens has built something good here." "Yes," Hannah agreed, her voice faint. They sat in silence for a while. The marshal sipped his coffee and seemed content to wait. Hannah's nerves were stretched to the breaking point when she finally heard the sound of a horse approaching. Lucas rode into view, and when he saw the marshal on his porch, his posture stiffened. But he rode in steadily, dismounted, and walked up to the porch. "Marshal Cooper," he said, and there was both surprise and wariness in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you in person." So this was Marshal Cooper, the federal lawman Lucas had written to. Hannah felt a tiny flicker of hope kindle in her chest. Cooper stood and extended his hand. Lucas shook it, then glanced at Hannah. In that look, she saw reassurance, a silent message to trust him. "Got your letter," Cooper said. "Interesting reading. Thought it was worth a trip to hear more in person." His gaze moved to Hannah. "I'm guessing you're Hannah Brennan." Hannah stood, her back straight despite the fear coursing through her. "Hannah Lawson," she corrected. "Brennan was my married name." "Fair enough," Cooper said. "Miss Lawson, I'd like to hear your side of things, all of it, in your own words." So Hannah told her story again, from the beginning this time. She told him about marrying Thomas, about discovering his involvement in rustling, about the night Frank Morrison had murdered her husband and framed her for it. She told him about Marshal Garrett's determination to see her hanged, about Charlie Worth helping her escape, about her desperate flight to Douglas. Cooper listened without interrupting, his face impassive. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been looking into the rustling operation your husband was part of. It's bigger than you probably realize. We're talking about hundreds of head of cattle stolen over the past 3 years, moved across territorial and state lines. The financial damage is considerable." "I didn't know the extent of it," Hannah said. "Thomas kept me out of that part of his life." "I believe you," Cooper said. "I've been doing this job for 20 years and I've gotten pretty good at reading people. You're not a liar, Miss Lawson, and you're definitely not a killer." The relief that washed over Hannah was so intense she had to sit down. Lucas moved to her side immediately, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "However," Cooper continued, "believing you and proving your innocence are two different things. Marshal Garrett has an arrest warrant sworn out against you. Unless I can provide evidence that Frank Morrison is the real killer, that warrant stands." "What kind of evidence would you need?" Lucas asked. Cooper pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. "I've been investigating the rustling ring for 6 months now. Your husband's name came up multiple times, Miss Lawson, as did Frank Morrison's. There are others involved too, including some prominent ranchers I won't name yet. What's interesting is that about a month before your husband's death, he reached out to us." Hannah's eyes widened. "He did. He sent a letter offering to provide evidence against his partners in exchange for immunity. We were in the process of negotiating with him when he was killed." Cooper looked up from his notebook. "We have that letter in his handwriting. It establishes a clear motive for Morrison to want him dead." "So that proves Frank killed him," Hannah said. "It establishes motive," Cooper corrected. "But we need more. We need witnesses, physical evidence, something that directly contradicts Morrison's story." He paused. "Tell me about the scene that night. Everything you remember." Hannah closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that terrible evening. "Thomas was sitting at the table in our front room. There was money on the table, stacks of bills. Frank came in angry, yelling about Thomas betraying them. He shot Thomas once in the chest. Thomas fell backward." She opened her eyes. "Then Frank shot him twice more while he was already down. Then he grabbed my hand and pressed the gun into it before I could stop him. The barrel was still hot. It burned my palm." "Which hand?" Cooper asked. "My right hand." Cooper made a note. "And you dropped the gun immediately?" "Yes. I couldn't hold on to it. My hand hurt and I was in shock." "So you would have had powder residue on your right hand only, not your left?" "I suppose so. I don't know much about guns." "Trust me, if you'd fired that weapon 3 times, you would have had residue on both hands," Cooper said. Did Garrett test your hands for powder residue? Hannah frowned, trying to remember. No, he just arrested me, sloppy, Cooper muttered, making another note. What about the angle of the shots? You mentioned that in Lucas's letter. Thomas was sitting down and Frank was standing, so the bullets went into him at a downward angle. If I had shot him, standing where I was in the doorway, the angle would have been different, more straight on. Cooper nodded slowly. That's good. That's very good. If I can get a look at the body, or at least a coroner's report, that would go a long way toward proving your story. The body would have been buried by now, Lucas said. It's been weeks. Yes, but there should be a coroner's report in the county records. That's a matter of public record, even if Garrett doesn't want me seeing it. Cooper stood. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ride to Tombstone and start gathering evidence. I'll talk to Charlie Worth, the deputy who helped you escape. I'll review the coroner's report. I'll interview Frank Morrison, see if his story holds up under pressure. And I'll have a conversation with Marshal Garrett about proper procedure. That sounds dangerous, Hannah said. Frank and Garrett won't want you poking around. They don't have a choice, Cooper said with a grim smile. Federal authority trumps local. They can be unhappy about it all they want, but they'll cooperate or face charges of obstruction. He turned to Lucas. In the meantime, keep her safe. Don't let her show her face in any towns. If Garrett gets wind that she's here, he could try to arrest her before I've finished my investigation. She'll be safe, Lucas promised. After Cooper left, riding back toward Douglas in the gathering dusk, Hannah and Lucas stood on the porch in silence. Finally, Hannah said, Do you think he can do it? Prove my innocence. I think if anyone can, it's Cooper, Lucas said. He's got a reputation for being thorough and stubborn. Hannah leaned against the porch railing, suddenly exhausted. I'm afraid to hope. Every time I let myself hope, something goes wrong. Lucas moved to stand beside her. Hope's not easy, but it's necessary. Without it, what's the point of anything? She turned to look at him. In the fading light, his face was shadowed, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. You're a good man, Lucas Owens. Better than I deserve. That's foolishness talking, Lucas said softly. You deserve good things, Hannah. You deserve justice and peace and a chance at happiness. His hand came up to touch her face, a gentle brush of calloused fingers against her cheek. Hannah's breath caught. She should pull away, should put distance between them. But she didn't want to. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes closing. Hannah, Lucas said, and his voice was rough with emotion. I need to tell you something. These past few weeks, having you here, I've realized something. I've realized that this house was empty before you came. My life was empty. I was going through the motions, building this ranch without really understanding why. But now I know why. I was waiting for you. Hannah opened her eyes. Lucas, I'm not free. I'm wanted for murder. I might be arrested, hanged. Getting involved with me is worth it, Lucas interrupted. You're worth it. Whatever happens, wherever this goes, I want you to know that. You're worth everything to me. And then he was kissing her, and Hannah was kissing him back, and for that moment nothing else existed. Not the murder charge, not Frank Morrison, not Marshal Garrett. There was only Lucas, only the warmth of his mouth on hers, the strength of his arms as he pulled her close, the racing of her heart that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with joy. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. I'm falling in love with you, Hannah Lawson, he whispered. Might have already fallen. Just thought you should know. Tears stung Hannah's eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. I think I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered back, and it terrifies me. Good things are often terrifying, Lucas said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips again, gentle touches that made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before. But we'll face the terror together. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That night, they sat on the porch long after full dark, hands clasped, talking about dreams and futures and possibilities. Hannah told Lucas about her desire to teach again someday, to have a classroom full of eager young minds. Lucas told her about his plans to expand the ranch, maybe bring in some breeding stock to improve the herd. They talked about children, about growing old, about building a life that mattered. It was probably foolish to make such plans when Hannah's future was so uncertain. But somehow, sitting there in the darkness with Lucas's hand warm in hers, it felt right. It felt like hope, fragile but real. The weeks that followed were strange, suspended between anxiety and contentment. Hannah waited for word from Marshall Cooper while simultaneously falling deeper in love with Lucas. They worked side by side during the days, and in the evenings they would sit together and talk, or sometimes just exist in comfortable silence. Lucas had moved his bedroll to the barn, insisting that it wasn't proper for them to sleep under the same roof without being married, despite Hannah's protests that they each had separate rooms. "I want to do this right," he had said firmly. "When we marry, and I hope we will, I want it to be with everything proper and above board. I won't have anyone questioning your honor." Hannah had been touched by his old-fashioned sense of propriety, even as she missed his presence in the house at night. 3 weeks after Marshall Cooper's visit, another rider appeared. This time it was a young man carrying a telegram. Lucas was in the barn when he arrived, and Hannah signed for the message with shaking hands. The telegram was brief. "Evidence gathered. Returning Douglas 3 days. Cooper." Lucas came out of the barn and saw Hannah standing in the yard, the telegram clutched in her hand. He crossed to her quickly. "What is it?" She handed him the telegram. He read it, then looked at her with an expression of cautious optimism. 3 days. He'll be here in 3 days." Those 3 days crawled by like months. Hannah couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. She alternated between hope and despair, imagining every possible outcome. What if Cooper hadn't found enough evidence? What if Marshall Garrett had interfered? What if Frank had somehow convinced Cooper of his lies? Lucas did his best to keep her calm and distracted, but even his steady presence couldn't entirely ease her anxiety. On the 3rd day, they rode into Douglas together, with Hannah wearing a bonnet that shadowed her face and a shawl that covered her distinctive dark hair. They went directly to Mrs. Chen's boarding house, where Cooper had sent word he would meet them. The marshal was waiting in Mrs. Chen's small parlor, looking tired but satisfied. He stood when they entered, and Hannah searched his face desperately for clues. "Sit down," Cooper said, gesturing to the chairs. "I have news, and it's good." Hannah sank into a chair, her knees suddenly weak. Lucas stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, supporting her. "I spent 3 weeks in Tombstone and the surrounding area," Cooper began. "I interviewed everyone connected to your husband's death, Miss Lawson, including Deputy Charlie Worth, who confirmed your story. I also interviewed Frank Morrison at length." A smile touched Cooper's lips. "Morrison's not as clever as he thinks he is. His story had holes big enough to drive a cattle herd through. For instance, he claimed you were standing directly in front of your husband when you shot him. But the coroner's report, which I obtained from county records, shows the bullet wounds were at a downward angle inconsistent with someone of your height shooting from that position." Hannah gripped the arms of her chair. "So the evidence proves he's lying." "That and more. I also spoke to your neighbor, the one who came when Morrison called for help. He admitted under pressure that Morrison seemed too calm, too collected for someone who had just witnessed a murder. Said it struck him as odd at the time, but he didn't question it." Cooper pulled out his notebook. "Then there's the matter of the powder residue. I spoke to a firearms expert who confirmed that anyone firing 3 shots from the type of gun used would have residue on both hands, not just one. You only had it on your right hand, where Morrison forced the gun into your grip. Is that enough? Lucas asked. Enough to clear her name, by itself, maybe not. But then I had a very interesting conversation with one of Thomas Brennan's other partners, a man named Jack Wheeler. Wheeler's been worried since Brennan's death that he might be next. When I offered him immunity in exchange for testimony, he told me everything. Cooper's smile widened. Wheeler was there the night Morrison killed Brennan. He was waiting outside holding the horses. He heard the whole thing. Morrison shouting about betrayal, the gunshots. Morrison telling you how he was going to frame you. Hannah couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down her face and her whole body was shaking. Lucas's hands tightened on her shoulders. Wheeler's willing to testify, Cooper continued. And with his testimony, combined with the physical evidence, we have more than enough to charge Morrison with murder and to exonerate you completely. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. This is a letter from the territorial judge dismissing all charges against you. As of this moment, Hannah Lawson, you're a free woman. Hannah took the letter with trembling hands. The words blurred through her tears, but she could see the official seal, the judge's signature. Free. She was free. Lucas pulled her up from the chair and into his arms, holding her tight while she cried. They were good tears, tears of relief and joy and disbelief. Over her head, Lucas said to Cooper, "What about Morrison and Marshall Garrett? Morrison's in federal custody, awaiting trial for murder. He'll hang, which is no more than he deserves." Cooper's voice hardened. As for Garrett, he's under investigation for dereliction of duty and possibly collusion with Morrison. He won't be a marshal much longer. Good, Lucas said fiercely. He deserves worse. Eventually, Hannah pulled herself together enough to speak. Thank you, Marshal Cooper. I don't know how to repay you for this. No repayment necessary, Cooper said kindly. I was just doing my job, making sure justice is served for everyone, not just for those with friends in high places. He stood. You're free to go anywhere you want now, Miss Lawson. Rebuild your life wherever you choose. Hannah looked up at Lucas. His storm-gray eyes were bright with emotion, and the love she saw there made her heart swell. I already know where I want to be, she said softly. They rode back to the ranch in a daze of happiness. Hannah kept touching the letter in her pocket, reassuring herself it was real, free. She was free to live her life, to make her own choices, to build a future without constantly looking over her shoulder. That evening, as they stood on the porch watching the sunset, Lucas turned to her and took both her hands in his. Hannah Lawson, he said, I know we haven't known each other long, just a handful of weeks, but in that time you've become everything to me. This ranch, my life, none of it means anything if you're not part of it. Hannah's heart was pounding. She knew what was coming and she wanted it more than she had wanted anything in her life. Lucas dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Will you marry me? Will you stay here and build a life with me? I promise I'll spend every day trying to make you happy. I promise I'll listen to you, respect you, love you the way you deserve. I promise. Yes, Hannah interrupted, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, Lucas. Yes to all of it. He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around on the porch while she laughed. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that made her dizzy. I love you, he said against her lips. I love you so much. I love you too, Hannah said, more than I knew was possible. They were married 3 weeks later in Douglas, in a small ceremony at the church with Mrs. Chen and Marshall Cooper as witnesses. Hannah wore a simple dress of pale blue that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Lucas wore his best suit, looking both nervous and radiantly happy. The minister spoke about love and commitment and new beginnings, And when Lucas slipped the ring onto Hannah's finger, she felt as if her heart might burst from joy. The years that followed were good ones, better than Hannah had ever dared to dream. Lucas's ranch prospered, growing from a small spread to a respectable operation. Hannah helped with the work, learning to manage cattle and horses, to keep books, to make decisions about breeding and selling. In the second year of their marriage, she also started teaching again, opening a small schoolhouse on their land for the children of neighboring ranchers. It started with just 3 students but grew quickly, and Hannah found deep satisfaction in shaping young minds once more. Their first child, a son they named James Lucas Owens after Marshall Cooper and his father, was born in the winter of 1880. He was a healthy, loud baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and Lucas was utterly besotted with him from the first moment. Hannah would often find her husband sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, holding their son and talking to him about the ranch, about horses, about the land they would pass down to him someday. 2 years later, their daughter Eleanor was born, named for Lucas's lost sister. She was quieter than her brother, but had a fierce determination that reminded Hannah of herself. And 3 years after Eleanor came another son, Thomas, named in memory of Hannah's first husband because Lucas believed in forgiveness and moving forward. He wasn't all bad, Lucas had said when they discussed the name. He was lost, made terrible choices, but he was still a human being, and his death led you to me, so in a way, I owe him for that. The children grew up strong and healthy, running wild across the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, sitting in their mother's schoolhouse and absorbing knowledge like sponges. James was serious and responsible, already showing signs of the rancher he would become. Eleanor was bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. Thomas was the dreamer, the one who would sit for hours watching the clouds and making up stories about where they were going. Marshall Cooper became a regular visitor to the ranch, a beloved honorary uncle to the children. He had resigned from federal service eventually and opened a small law practice in Tucson. But he made the trip to visit the Owens family several times a year, always bringing gifts and stories from his travels. Frank Morrison was hanged in 1879, convicted of murder after a trial that laid bare the entire rustling operation. Several other men went to prison, including 2 prominent ranchers who had been fencing stolen cattle. Marshall Garrett was stripped of his badge and quietly left the territory in disgrace. Charlie Worth, the young deputy who had helped Hannah escape, eventually became the Marshal of Tombstone, a position he held with honor for many years. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful, Hannah would sit on the porch with Lucas and marvel at how much her life had changed. From a terrified fugitive with no hope and no future, she had become a wife, a mother, a teacher, a partner in a successful ranch. The past was still there, the memories of fear and loss, but they had faded like old photographs, losing their power to hurt her. You ever regret it? Lucas asked her one evening. They were both in their 40s now, with silver threading through their hair and lines around their eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. Marrying me, staying here this life. Hannah looked at him, at this man who had stood beside her through everything, who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, who had loved her through good times and hard times with unwavering devotion. Not for a single moment, she said. This life with you, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Lucas smiled and reached for her hand. They told you that you'd never escape your past, he said, echoing words he had spoken many times over the years. But we proved them wrong. Together we rode into a new tomorrow. And what a tomorrow it's been, Hannah said softly. She leaned her head on his shoulder, content and at peace. Inside the house, their children were laughing about something, the sound bright and joyful. Beyond the porch, the land stretched out in all directions, their land, the home they had built together. The sun was setting in glory over the mountains, painting the sky in impossible colors. Hannah had been 25 years old when she fled Tombstone, certain that her life was over, that there was no future for her beyond running and hiding. She had been wrong. The future had been waiting all along in the form of a cowboy with storm-gray eyes and a heart full of honor. Years continued to pass, marked by seasons and harvests, by cattle drives and school terms, by birthdays and holidays and all the small moments that make up a life. James grew into a fine young man, taking over more and more of the ranch work, as Lucas's joints began to protest the long days in the saddle. Eleanor surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to become a doctor, a bold ambition for a woman in the 1890s, but Lucas and Hannah supported her dream, helping her apply to medical schools back east. Thomas found his calling in art, sketching the landscapes of Arizona with a skill that drew praise from everyone who saw his work. The ranch continued to thrive. Lucas and Hannah proved to be excellent partners, with Lucas's practical knowledge of cattle and horses complementing Hannah's head for numbers and organization. They expanded gradually, buying adjacent land when it became available, building up their herds, gaining a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. In 1895, when Hannah was 42 and Lucas 45, they received word that Eleanor had been accepted to medical school in Philadelphia. The whole family celebrated, though Hannah cried to think of her daughter so far away. But Eleanor was determined, and in the fall she boarded the train east, promising to write every week. She kept that promise. Letters arrived regularly, full of details about her studies, about the wonders and challenges of the big city, about the other students and professors. And true to her word, Eleanor completed her medical training and returned to Arizona Territory, opening a practice in Douglas where she served the community for decades. James married a rancher's daughter named Sarah in 1897, and they built their own house on the far side of the Owens property, raising 4 children of their own while working the land alongside Lucas and Hannah. Thomas eventually moved to Santa Fe, where his paintings began to attract serious attention from collectors and galleries. Through it all, Lucas and Hannah remained devoted to each other. They had their disagreements, as any married couple does, but they always talked through their problems, always found ways to compromise and understand each other. The love that had bloomed in those desperate early days only deepened with time, becoming something rich and enduring and unshakable. In 1905, when Arizona Territory was still years away from statehood but growing and modernizing rapidly, Lucas and Hannah celebrated their 27th anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party, and as Hannah looked around at all the faces, all the lives that had sprung from the choice she and Lucas had made to love each other, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Marshall Cooper, now in his 70s but still spry, raised a glass in toast. "To Lucas and Hannah Owens," he said, "two of the finest people I've ever had the privilege to know. May you have many more years together." "Hear, hear," everyone chorused, raising their glasses. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Lucas and Hannah walked down to the creek that ran through their property. The moon was full, silvering the water and the grass. They stood hand in hand, listening to the night sounds, crickets singing, cattle settling, an owl calling from the cottonwoods. 27 years, Lucas said wonderingly. "Seems like yesterday you were standing in Douglas with a carpetbag, looking lost and scared. "I was lost and scared," Hannah said, "and then you found me." "We found each other," Lucas corrected. He pulled her close and they swayed together in a slow dance without music. "Best thing I ever did was step in to help a stranger that day. Best decision of my life." "Mine too," Hannah said. "Well, second best. Best decision was saying yes when you proposed." Lucas laughed softly. "Think we still have some good years ahead of us." "I know we do," Hannah said with certainty. She looked up at him, at the face she knew as well as her own, at the eyes that still held the same love they had shown her from the beginning. "As long as we're together, every year is a good year." They stood by the creek for a long time, holding each other under the stars. Two people who had found love in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a life that mattered. Behind them was a past full of pain and fear, but also full of courage and hope. Ahead was a future full of promise and possibility. They had ridden together into a new tomorrow, and tomorrow had turned into a lifetime of joy. Years continued their steady march, bringing changes both welcome and bittersweet. Lucas's hair turned completely silver, and his hands, once so strong and sure, began to tremble with age. Hannah's dark hair went gray as well, and she found she needed spectacles for reading, but her mind remained sharp and her spirit undimmed. In 1912, Arizona finally achieved statehood, and the Owens family celebrated along with the rest of the territory turned state. James was running the ranch almost entirely by then, with Lucas serving as advisor and consultant, still valued for his decades of experience, even if he could no longer do the physical work. Hannah had closed her schoolhouse a few years earlier when the county built a proper school in Douglas, but she remained involved in education, serving on the school board and advocating for better resources and teacher training. She also wrote occasional articles for the Territorial, then State, newspapers about women's rights and education reform, using her own story of overcoming injustice as inspiration. Aliner's medical practice flourished, and she became known as one of the best doctors in southern Arizona, treating everyone from wealthy ranchers to poor Mexican workers with equal skill and compassion. She never married, declaring that her work was her passion, but she was beloved by her nieces and nephews, who adored their accomplished aunt. Thomas's paintings had made him modestly famous in artistic circles. He held shows in Santa Fe, Denver, and even once in New York City. But he always came home to Arizona for Christmas, bringing his latest work to show his parents, seeking their approval even as a grown man. In the summer of 1915, Lucas fell ill. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then developed into a deeper weakness. Aliner examined him and diagnosed pneumonia complicated by a weak heart. She did everything she could, but at 62, Lucas's body was wearing out. Hannah rarely left his bedside during those final weeks. She read to him, talked with him about their life together, held his hand through the long nights. The children came to visit, bringing the grandchildren to say goodbye. Marshall Cooper, now ancient but still alive, made one last trip to see his old friend. On a warm August evening, with Hannah holding his hand and Aliner monitoring his vital signs, Lucas squeezed Hannah's fingers and smiled. "Still the most beautiful thing I ever saw," he whispered, looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that had lost none of their love over the decades. "I love you," Hannah said, tears streaming down her face. "I will always love you." "I know," Lucas said, "and that's all that matters, that's everything." He closed his eyes then, his breathing growing shallow. Hannah held him as he slipped away, held him until he took his last breath, held him still until Aliner gently pried her fingers loose and led her away. The grief was immense, a tidal wave that threatened to drown Hannah. For weeks, she moved through life in a fog, unable to fully accept that Lucas was gone, that the man who had been her partner, her love, her everything for 37 years was no longer beside her. The ranch felt empty without him, even filled with children and grandchildren. The bed felt cold. The mornings felt pointless. But slowly, with the support of her family and the passage of time, Hannah began to heal. She would never stop missing Lucas, would never stop wishing he was still with her. But she also knew he would want her to keep living, to keep finding joy in the world. She threw herself into her writing, penning a memoir about her experiences that was published in 1917 and became a modest success. She advocated for women's suffrage, living long enough to see women gain the right to vote in 1920. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, making sure they knew what kind of man he had been. And every evening, she would walk down to the creek and stand where she and Lucas had stood on their anniversary, remembering the love they had shared, feeling his presence in the whisper of the wind and the murmur of the water. Hannah lived to be 81 years old, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1934, surrounded by 3 generations of family. She died in the house Lucas had built, on the ranch they had made successful together, secure in the knowledge that her life had mattered, that she had made a difference. James inherited the ranch and ran it successfully for another 20 years before passing it to his own children. The Owens Ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to the legacy Lucas and Hannah had built together. Eleanor practiced medicine until she was 70, saving countless lives and inspiring a generation of young women to enter the medical profession. Thomas's paintings hung in museums and private collections across the Southwest, capturing the beauty of Arizona for future generations to appreciate. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun painted the sky in impossible colors and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, people said they could see 2 figures standing by the creek, hand in hand, 2 spirits who had loved each other so deeply that not even death could part them. They had been told she would never escape her past, that her life was over, that there was no hope. But a cowboy with honor and courage had ridden beside her into a new tomorrow, and together they had built something beautiful, something that endured long after they were gone. Their love story became legend in southern Arizona, passed down through the generations as a reminder that hope exists even in the darkest moments, that love can triumph over injustice, and that tomorrow is always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. The Owens family still gathers at the ranch every summer for a reunion, descendants of James and Sarah coming from across the country to reconnect with their roots. They walk the land their great-great-grandparents worked, swim in the creek where Lucas and Hannah stood on so many evenings, and tell stories about the woman who was accused of murder and the cowboy who saved her, about a love that changed everything, about riding together into a new tomorrow that became a lifetime of happiness and meaning. And in Douglas, Arizona, there is a small historical marker outside the old Chen's boarding house, long since converted to other uses, that tells the story of Hannah Lawson Owens, the teacher who was wrongly accused, who fought for justice, who built a life of purpose and love. It mentions Lucas Owens, too, the rancher who stood by her, who believed in her, who loved her through everything. Tourists stop to read the marker, taking photographs, marveling at the story of 2 people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and created something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. Because that's what real love does. It endures. It builds. It creates ripples that spread out through time, touching lives decades or even centuries later. Hannah and Lucas's love was like that, a force that shaped not just their own lives but the lives of everyone who came after them, a reminder that even in the hardest times, hope and love can prevail. They rode together into a new tomorrow, and that tomorrow became a legacy that would never fade.